He played a flawless piece, while the crime unfolded nearby. Welcome to Tea and Clues. I am your host, Daxon. Tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. Every message from you means so much. Now, the story. It was a glorious June afternoon in the village of Charnley St. Mary. One of those rare English days when the sky was an unbroken blue and the air smelled of elderflower and freshly trimmed hedges. The annual summer fete at Fernwood Hall was in full swing. Stalls laden with jam jars and scones, children darting about with ribbons in their hair, and elderly ladies shading their delicate complexions under wide-brimmed hats. Miss Jane Marple sat primly beneath a white parasol in the corner of the lawn, sipping a weak cup of tea. She was not overly fond of fetes, truth be told. They tended to involve too many wasps and too much idle chatter. But she never missed them. One could learn a great deal at such events, more than most people realized. Fernwood Hall itself stood proudly behind her, a stately Georgian manor with ivy creeping up its limestone facade. Once the family seat of the late Colonel Eustace Arbuthnot, it now belonged to his son, Leonard Arbuthnot, and his strikingly glamorous second wife, Clarissa. The pair were hosting the fete as part of a fundraising effort for the restoration of the village church roof, a cause worthy enough to distract the gossips from the less charitable speculation about Clarissa's supposed continental affairs. The highlight of the afternoon was to be a piano recital in the drawing room, performed by a rising star from London, Mr. Dominic Harwood. Tall, pale and brooding, with a thick shock of black hair and a temperament described delicately as artistic, Mr. Harwood was a friend of Clarissa's from her theatre days and had agreed to play a few light classics to add prestige to the event. By 3:30, the guests had filtered inside, fanning themselves with programs as they took their seats. Miss Marple remained at the edge, close enough to hear, but far enough to observe unnoticed. Her knitting, ever present, lay idle in her lap. Dominic Harwood took his place at the grand piano. He bowed with theatrical flair, fingers hovering over the keys like a conjurer before a trick. He began with Chopin, delicate, mournful, and followed with Liszt, then an unexpected Gershwin piece that raised a few polite eyebrows. He played beautifully, but his manner was tense. Several times he glanced toward the far end of the room where Clarissa sat, fanning herself too quickly, her smile fixed and unreadable. Leonard Arbuthnot, by contrast, looked bored and heavy-lidded, nursing a brandy glass, though it was barely past tea time. Then it happened. At the end of a haunting Debussy nocturne, Harwood paused, his fingers lingering on the final note. He lifted his hands and stood slowly. For a moment there was only silence, the audience holding its breath, not sure whether to clap. Then a single sharp gasp rang out from the back of the room. Mrs. Edith Blackwell, the vicar's wife, had gone quite pale. She was staring at something, or someone, just beyond the doorway. A second later there was a crash of porcelain as someone dropped a teacup. Confusion spread like ripples on a pond. Leonard Arbuthnot rose to his feet abruptly. "What on earth?" From the hallway came a cry. "Call the doctor! Someone's collapsed in the study!" The drawing room burst into murmurs as guests rose and pressed toward the hallway. Miss Marple did not move immediately. Instead, she closed her handbag quietly and watched the scene unfold through the reflection in a glass cabinet. Within moments, word spread. Dr. Hayward, summoned from the garden, hurried inside with practiced efficiency. Minutes later, the whisper became fact. Someone was dead. It was Mr. Julian Roper, the solicitor from Lower Charkham, found slumped across Leonard Arbuthnot's desk. Dead before he hit the floor, they said. No visible wound, no sign of distress. Just a faint smell of almonds in the air, someone remarked. Cyanide. Miss Marple, now on her feet and unnoticed amidst the clamour, allowed herself the smallest frown. Mr. Roper had been seen only an hour earlier, laughing with Leonard near the punch bowl. Not the sort of man to suddenly expire without cause, and certainly not the sort of man she suspected to drink cyanide by mistake. From behind her, the piano echoed faintly with a half-played chord, forgotten in the rush, the instrument's keys still depressed from Harwood's final note. Miss Marple looked back once before stepping quietly into the hallway. The fate was over. The murder had just begun. The news travelled faster than the wind through the lavender hedges. By tea-time, the next day, the death of Mr. Julian Roper had passed through no fewer than 4 distinct retellings, each with more vivid detail than the last. In Charnley St. Mary, gossip was not so much a vice as a communal duty, conducted with the same precision and ritual as the Morning Post or Evensong. Mrs. Louise Bartlett, the churchwarden's wife and self-appointed custodian of moral propriety, leaned over her garden wall to inform Mrs. Daisy Entwistle that she had it on good authority that Mr. Roper had been poisoned by a rare South American plant extract used by indigenous tribes in ceremonial rituals. "No visible wounds," she said gravely, pressing her fingers to her lips. "And he was blue, Daisy, blue as a kingfisher." Mrs. Entwistle, not to be outdone, countered with aversion gleaned from her butcher's sister-in-law. "It was suicide, Lou, plain as daylight. He lost a fortune in that chain of cinemas in Bournemouth. He drank something nasty and collapsed in the study, right in front of Leonard's war medals." By the following morning, 2 more theories had emerged. One involved a cursed piano key imported from Vienna, and the other insisted that Julian Roper had been in possession of dangerous political secrets linked to his military days. Miss Marple listened to all of this with her usual benign expression, her delicate hands folded neatly over her shopping basket as she lingered outside Hatcher's Grocers. She offered no opinion, no interruption, only the occasional murmur of interest and the faintest tilt of her head when something particularly revealing passed between her neighbour's lips. It was the postmistress, Miss Lydia Brent, who brought the talk back to the obvious question as they queued for eggs. "Why was Mr. Roper even there, Jane?" she asked, peering at Miss Marple with sharp, inquisitive eyes behind pince-nez spectacles. "He wasn't on the fate committee. Never seen him lift a finger for village causes." "True," Miss Marple replied mildly, "but I did see him deep in conversation with Leonard Arbuthnot last week, outside the bank. Rather an intense discussion. They didn't notice me, of course." Miss Brent leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Do you think it was about money?" "I should imagine everything comes down to money in the end," said Miss Marple, selecting a half-dozen eggs. "Or love, or both, often enough." Back at her rose-covered cottage on the edge of the green, Miss Marple made herself a modest lunch of cold ham and watercress. As she ate, she laid out her thoughts like numbered stitches in her knitting. 1. Julian Roper had died suddenly, and the doctor, who knew him well, had declared it unnatural. That was telling in itself. People did die from heart attacks or strokes, of course, but Dr. Hayward was not the sort to be melodramatic without cause. 2. There had been a faint smell of almonds. Cyanide, if the rumours were to be believed. But cyanide wasn't the sort of thing one stumbled across accidentally in a village pantry. That suggested planning. Intent. 3. Clarissa Arbuthnot had appeared visibly distressed during Harwood's performance, though she had later claimed it was merely the heat. Miss Marple had seen a great many women claim weakness when it suited their needs, and even more pretend strength when it did not. 4. Mr. Harwood himself, a peculiar young man. He had played with great emotion, but Miss Marple had noticed something. Behind his performance, a tenseness in the shoulders, a distracted cadence in the music as though his mind had been elsewhere. More than stage fright, she thought. She was just tidying her plate when there came a knock at the door. It was Inspector George Craddock, tall and ruddy-faced, hat in hand. "Miss Marple," he said with a weary smile, "may I trouble you for a moment?" "Of course, Inspector. Do come in. Would you care for some tea? He declined with a shake of his head and sat opposite her in the parlour, glancing about as if to absorb the tranquillity of the surroundings. A needlepoint cushion read, "Blessed. Are the curious, for they shall have adventures," and it made him smile faintly. "We've confirmed it was cyanide," he said without preamble. "No doubt about that. Mixed into the brandy decanter in Leonard Arbuthnot's study, we found the remains of a small glass vial near the fireplace." Miss Marple nodded once. "So whoever did it knew he would go in there for a drink." "Exactly. He was in the drawing room for the recital, then slipped away, probably for a quick tot before enduring the rest of the Chopin. Pardon my taste." She gave a soft chuckle. "But what puzzles me," Craddock continued, "is why anyone would want to murder Roper in the first place. Not particularly well liked, granted, but not hated either. No enemies that we've uncovered yet." "Have you asked Leonard Arbuthnot?" Miss Marple asked, refilling her teacup. "Several times. He's rattled, naturally, but swears it. Was a dreadful shock. Said Roper had stopped by to discuss a private matter and stayed for the music out of courtesy." "And Clarissa?" Craddock sighed. Hard to get a straight answer out of her. That woman would flirt with a hat stand. She admitted she invited Harwood, but claimed she didn't know Roper would come. That seems unlikely. "Quite," said Miss Marple softly. "She's a poor liar, I'm afraid." Craddock gave her a sideways glance. "You're already forming a theory, aren't you?" No, merely making observations. That's all I ever do." He stood to leave. "Well, if anything strikes you, I shall be sure to let you know," Miss Marple finished. "In the meantime, I would keep an eye on the pianist." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Harwood?" "There was something in the way he played," she said, her tone almost apologetic. "A sadness or guilt, perhaps. Not about the music, I think." As the inspector departed, Miss Marple turned to the window where her roses climbed in tidy spirals. She noticed a figure passing by, Clarissa Arbuthnot, walking briskly toward the churchyard, her face obscured by a fashionable straw hat. She was not alone. Dominic Harwood followed a few paces behind, as if hoping not to be seen. "Miss—" Marple leaned forward just slightly, watching as the pair disappeared behind the tall stone wall. Her tea had gone cold, but she made no move to replace it. The parish of Charnley St. Mary wore its grief in the usual manner, mild, dignified, and slightly theatrical. Black armbands appeared on the older gentlemen, though most of them hadn't spoken to Julian Roper in more than a year. The flower arrangements in the church were hastily converted from fete garlands to solemn tributes, and the bell-ringer, young Henry Cresswell, insisted on tolling the tenor bell, even though no funeral had been scheduled. Mrs. Fanshawe, head of the Altar Guild, called it inappropriate but touching. Meanwhile, behind the hedges and between cups of tea, suspicion grew like bindweed. Leonard Arbuthnot had taken to walking the grounds of Fernwood Hall with a cigar clenched in his, teeth and his brows drawn tight, brushing off questions with brisk, irritable shrugs. Clarissa, in contrast, was nowhere to be seen, having apparently confined herself to bed with a mysterious nervous exhaustion. Miss Marple, ever courteous, sent over a jar of quince jelly and a small note written in her fine, looping script. "Do take care, my dear. Fatigue is a treacherous sort of thing, so often the companion of guilty consciences and overtaxed spirits." She received no reply. The investigation began in earnest the following morning. Inspector Craddock returned to Fernwood Hall with a pair of constables and a list of questions. He spoke first with Leonard, whose stiff manner barely concealed his. "Annoyance. Julian Roper was a business associate," Leonard stated flatly. "He'd asked to meet in private, something to do with a land inheritance, a cousin's property in Devon, I believe. He wanted legal advice." "And did he get it?" Craddock asked. "I told him I wasn't interested. There was nothing beneficial in it for me, that was the extent of it. And he stayed for the fete anyway. Leonard rubbed his temple. Clarissa insisted. She said it would look rude to send him away. Craddock gave him a long look. Wouldn't be the first time your wife invited someone with a motive. Leonard's eyes narrowed. I don't like what you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Arbuthnot, Craddock replied. Not yet. While Craddock pressed on with his interviews, Miss Marple took a different route. She visited the vicarage under the pretense of returning a copy of Manners and Morals Among the Byzantines, which she had borrowed some months earlier. Inside, she found Mrs. Blackwell seated beside the fire with a basket of wool and a deeply furrowed brow. Dear Jane, she said, rising only halfway before sinking back down with a sigh, I do hope you've come with news. I'm quite beside myself. Miss Marple sat gently on the edge of a stiff-backed chair. No news, Edith, but I wondered if I might ask what you saw that afternoon in the drawing-room. You were the first to notice something was wrong, were you not? Mrs. Blackwell nodded, her hands fluttering. It was ghastly, absolutely ghastly. One moment I was admiring that final piece, the Debussy, you remember, and the next I saw Mr. Roper disappearing down the hall. I thought nothing of it, naturally. But then something caught my eye. What was it? Mrs. Blackwell hesitated. Clarissa. Her face. Not just pale. Drained. Horrified. She was staring at the hallway as though she'd seen a ghost. Miss Marple inclined her head. And what did she do? Nothing for a moment, just sat there frozen. Then she turned to Mr. Harwood and whispered something. He nodded, but he didn't look at her. He looked ashamed. Curious, Miss Marple murmured. Very curious. The next morning, Miss Marple stopped at the churchyard, where Dominic Harwood had been seen wandering more than once since the incident. She found him seated on a bench under a yew tree, staring at a patch of mossy gravestones. You play beautifully, she said as she approached. He looked up, startled. Oh, thank you, Miss Marple, Jane Marple. I was at the recital. He forced a smile. I'm glad someone enjoyed it. Music can be very revealing, I find. It expresses what words cannot. Harwood glanced down. That's rather the point, isn't it? They sat in silence for a moment. I suppose you've been wondering about that afternoon, he said finally. Everyone is. I never wonder, Miss Marple replied. I observe. He gave a humorless laugh. Then you must have observed something dreadful in me. I observed a man under great pressure, and one who was surprised, no, shocked by something that happened during the performance. He didn't answer, but his fingers gripped the bench. You knew Julian Roper, didn't you? Harwood looked up sharply. How? I didn't, but I know human nature, and you don't react to a stranger's death with shame. His voice dropped. He ruined someone I cared about years ago. She was an actress like Clarissa. He destroyed her reputation. Told lies, you see. Got her blacklisted from the only theatre company that would have her. Miss Marple's expression softened. And now he's dead. Yes. He looked at her, eyes dark. But I didn't kill him. I didn't even know he'd be there. You're sure? Clarissa didn't tell me. I wouldn't have come if I'd known. Miss Marple regarded him quietly. But when you saw him, I was furious. I could barely focus. I wanted to leave, but Clarissa said it would look suspicious. And so you stayed, Miss Marple said gently, and played Debussy as if your life depended on it. He blinked. I suppose I did. Later that day, Inspector Craddock paid another visit to Fernwood Hall, and was let in by the maid Ruby. Nervous and red-eyed, she wrung her hands as he stepped inside. I didn't say nothing earlier, sir, but I remember now. I saw Mr. Roper. That afternoon before the performance, he was arguing with Mrs. Arbuthnot. Quiet but nasty. About what? Something to do with a letter. He said, if this gets out, you'll be finished. She told him to keep his voice down. Then he stormed off. Craddock's jaw tightened. Did you see a letter? No, sir. But when I came to collect the glasses later, There was an envelope torn in two in the fireplace. I didn't touch it. Swear it. That evening, Miss Marple received a note slipped under her front door. No name, just a few lines in hurried pencil, and he threatened her. I think she feared what he knew, but I don't believe she meant for him to die. Not like that. Miss Marple read the note twice, then set it aside on her writing desk, beside a small jar of arsenic marked for slugs. She stared at it thoughtfully, tapping a fingernail against the wood. Secrets were surfacing, as they always did. But she had learned, through long experience, that the most damning clues were often found not in what people said, but in what they avoided saying altogether. She folded the note, locked it away, and resumed her knitting. A small knot was forming. In her mind, it would unravel soon. It was just after Sunday service that Inspector Craddock made his decision. A certain consensus had begun to settle over Charlie St. Mary, like fog over the downs. The young pianist, Dominic Harwood, was to blame. After all, hadn't he been seen following Clarissa Arbuthnot through the churchyard? Hadn't he looked pale and nervous during the recital, almost fevered? He had motive, a mysterious past with Julian Roper, and he had the opportunity. He'd been left alone in the drawing room during the interval, while Clarissa attended to a guest and Leonard was outdoors talking with the vicar. It wouldn't have taken more than a moment to slip something into the brandy decanter in the adjacent study. Clean as you like, Sergeant Barnes muttered over his notebook. Poisoned the drink, left no prints, slipped right back to the piano. You ask me, sir, he's too clever by half. Craddock rubbed his chin. A bit too clean, perhaps. But pressure was mounting. The chief superintendent had telephoned. Twice. London papers were sniffing around, asking questions about the murder at the music recital. Someone had even started sketching caricatures for a potential News of the World feature. Miss Marple herself had received an anonymous request for comment, which she ignored. So that afternoon, Craddock summoned Dominic Harwood to the police station under the pretext of a follow-up interview. The pianist arrived looking drawn and haggard, dressed in a crumpled grey suit with a collar too loose at the neck. He was ushered into the small interview room where Craddock sat waiting behind a neat stack of statements. You've already asked me everything I know, Harwood said wearily. I've told you what I saw, what I didn't see. Craddock tapped the top sheet. You didn't see Mr. Roper in the study, but someone else did. Ruby, the maid, she heard him threatening Clarissa. Did you know about that? Harwood stiffened. No. Well, you had good reason to hate him. Harwood's lips tightened. Yes, but that's not the same as murder. And the decanter, I never touched it. I didn't even know. There was a study next door until someone mentioned it afterward. I stayed near the piano. Craddock sat back, watching the young man carefully. You know, Harwood, when someone lies, they often give too much detail. But when someone tells the truth, they usually say too little. You're just right in the middle. Harwood gave a mirthless chuckle. Is that a compliment? Craddock didn't answer. He scribbled a note, then stood. You're not under arrest, but I suggest you don't leave the village. Harwood's face darkened. I've nowhere to go. Later that evening, Clarissa Arbuthnot finally re-emerged from her self-imposed exile. She appeared at the garden gate of St. Hilda's Hospice, delivering a basket of tinned food and medicinal powders. The scene was noted immediately by Mrs. Entwistle, who reported it to 3 people before sunset and claimed Clarissa had been all in white like a penitent nun. Miss Marple, however, was less impressed by appearances. She's performing, she told her friend Mrs. Weatherby over a game of cribbage. Not acting, performing. There's a difference. Acting is what one does when one wants to be believed. Performing is what one does when one knows eyes are watching. Mrs. Weatherby frowned. You don't think it was the pianist? I don't know anything yet, said Miss Marple calmly. But I have a suspicion. And I've learned over the years, dear, that when something seems almost too tidy, Too satisfyingly obvious it very often isn't. On Monday morning, Miss Marple took a purposeful stroll to Fernwood Hall, ostensibly to inquire after the chrysanthemums Leonard had promised to donate for the church altar. She was greeted by Clarissa herself, who looked more refreshed than one might expect from someone recently distraught. "I do apologize," Clarissa said with a fluttering hand gesture. "I've been frightfully unwell." "Oh, I quite understand," said Miss Marple gently. "Shock has strange effects on the system. It can even manifest as sleepiness, or an unexpected burst of energy." Clarissa hesitated. "Yes, quite." The drawing-room still bore faint echoes of that dreadful afternoon. The grand piano stood untouched, the scent of polish lingering in the air. Miss Marple glanced at it thoughtfully. Did Mr. Harwood know about the study next door? Clarissa blinked. I don't know. Why would he?" "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "He didn't go in there at all?" "No. He was in the drawing-room the whole time, and you're sure?" "Yes, well, no. I stepped out briefly to speak to Mrs. Blackwell about the raffle. I suppose he could have, but—" "Of course," Miss Marple said lightly. "One can't be everywhere." She looked around. "Do you have any of Mr. Roper's belongings still here?" Clarissa paled just slightly. "No? Why?" "Oh, I just thought, if he had a walking stick, for instance, or a pair of gloves. There's so much to be learned from personal objects. How a man lives, or how he lies." "I believe he left with everything he came with," Clarissa said too quickly. Miss Marple's eyes crinkled. "Did he? How efficient." That night, Craddock returned to Miss Marple's cottage for a quiet consultation. She served him rhubarb cake and tea, and he accepted both with the air of a man trying not to be grateful. "I don't like the way this is going," he admitted. "Dominic Harwood looks good for it, I'll admit, but something's off. It feels placed, if you know what I mean. Like a book whose villain appears too early," Miss Marple agreed. "One must always be suspicious of the neatness of such things." Craddock nodded. "Still, all roads lead to him, so far. But I've sent for some background checks on Clarissa. The letter that was burned, if we can reconstruct it even partially—" "Ah, yes," said Miss Marple softly. "The letter, most revealing. More than I think she realized when she tried to destroy it." "You think she was being blackmailed?" "I think Julian Roper had power over several people, the sort of man who collects secrets for sport." Craddock finished his cake in silence. "I still don't know who did it," he said finally, "but I've ruled out suicide, and I'm not convinced it was Harwood." "Nor am I," Miss Marple said, rising to refill the teapot. "He's wounded, but I don't think he's vicious. That sort of thing usually shows itself early in life, don't you find?" Craddock raised his cup. "To instincts, then?" "To human nature," Miss Marple corrected with a smile. Outside, a breeze stirred the hedges. Somewhere in the distance, the old church bell rang a single echoing note, solemn, slow, and terribly final. The village was ready to accept a suspect. Miss Marple was not. The dawn that followed was bright and dry, with a faint scent of honeysuckle clinging to the hedgerows. For most of Charnley St. Mary, it marked another step away from the dreadful business of Mr. Roper's death, toward the warm denial of normality. But not for Miss Marple. She had not slept well. There had been something niggling at her, something not quite said but certainly seen. She rose early, dressed with her usual efficiency, and took a detour on her morning walk that led not to the grocer but to Fernwood Hall. This time she didn't use the front door. Instead, she waited until Ruby, the maid, had emerged with a basket of laundry. Miss Marple, ever precise in her timing, intercepted her by the kitchen garden. "Good morning, Ruby," she said warmly. Ruby nearly dropped a sock in surprise. "Oh, Miss Marple, you gave me a start." "I do apologize. I just wondered if I might impose on your kindness. I seem to have misplaced a crochet hook. silver, rather fine, and I wondered if it might have been left in the drawing-room after the fete. Ruby hesitated, unsure. "I didn't see nothing, ma'am." "No trouble," Miss Marple said sweetly. "Might I have a peek myself? I'd hate to be a bother." It was in this fashion, guilt and goodwill being more powerful than any search, warrant, that Miss Marple soon found herself once again in the drawing-room of Fernwood Hall. The space had been put mostly to rights. The piano had been closed, a new bowl of roses placed atop it, yet the faint impression of tension lingered in the air, like the aftertaste of bad news. She made a small show of looking near the armchairs and under a lace-covered side table. Ruby lingered near the door. "Oh dear," Miss Marple murmured. "I wonder if it might have rolled into the study. That would be just my luck." Ruby bit her lip, but after a second's indecision, she nodded. "It's probably fine. Go on. Just don't touch anything." "Of course, dear, I never do." The study was dimmer than the drawing-room, the curtains partly drawn. A heavy oak desk stood in the centre, flanked by two wing-back chairs. Bookshelves lined one wall. The fireplace faced the window. The air still held a faint metallic scent beneath the polish, like old coins or almonds. Miss Marple stepped lightly, her eyes not on the desk or the decanter, but the hearth. She knelt beside it. A scattering of ashes remained from a fire long gone. Carefully, using the tip of a handkerchief, she shifted a piece of half-burned paper, the last corner of some correspondence, charred beyond legibility save for a tantalizing curve of a letter R. And there, just beside the grate, nearly camouflaged against the soot, lay a small black button. It was no ordinary button, not from a dress shirt, nor a suit coat. She recognized it at once as the type often found on musicians' waistcoats or formal evening wear, a cloth-covered disc with a firm back and loop. She folded it into the handkerchief and tucked it into her sleeve. An hour later, Miss Marple visited the vicarage. Not for any particular reason, at least not one she cared to state aloud. The Reverend Blackwell was out on his rounds, but Edith was home, immersed in the latest issue of Country Life. "I do hope I'm not intruding," said Miss Marple, removing her gloves. "Not at all. Do sit down, Jane. I was just reading about a new type of rose developed in Devon, supposed to be entirely resistant to aphids. Really? I'm not sure I trust anything that claims to resist aphids. They are the great equalizers of the garden world." Edith chuckled and poured tea. "Any new thoughts on the terrible business?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Actually, yes, something rather interesting. Do you recall how Mr. Harwood was dressed the day of the recital?" Edith blinked. "Well, he wore black, naturally, with a white shirt. I believe there was a bow. Tie and, oh yes, a waistcoat, a rather old-fashioned one. Did it have buttons? I should imagine so. One never sees them without." "Why?" Miss Marple smiled. "Just curious." That afternoon she paid a visit to Dominic Harwood, who was staying in the vicar's spare cottage, meant for itinerant scholars and visiting clergy. He answered the door looking worse for wear. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw unshaven. Not sure I should be speaking to anyone," he said bitterly. "The whole village thinks I'm a murderer." "That will pass," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "Villages always need a villain, but they rarely keep one for long. May I come in for a moment?" He stepped aside, and she entered a sparse sitting room with a piano tucked into the corner. Sheet music lay strewn across the floor. A crumpled waistcoat was draped over the back of a chair. "You played Debussy that day, didn't you?" "Yes." "I do love Debussy. Such melancholy. It always reminds me of secrets, the sort of music that lingers in your mind long after the final note." Harwood didn't reply. His gaze drifted to the window. "Did you notice," Miss Marple asked softly, "that you've lost a button?" Harwood started. "What?" She gestured to the waistcoat. "The second button from the top. Missing. I found one just like it in the study fireplace." His face paled. "I didn't go in there," he said slowly. "I swear it." "I believe you," she said at once, "but someone wants it to look as though you did. The button may have been planted, or perhaps taken, from another garment you own, but why? To frame you, I imagine, to cast suspicion just enough to distract from the truth." Harwood sat down heavily. "This is mad." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "It's methodical." She stood to leave. "You must be very careful, Mr. Harwood. Your innocence is no protection if someone else is determined to make you guilty, as—" She departed. She could feel the weight of the button in her sleeve. It was a small thing, most people would never have noticed it, but she had learned long ago that small things, the dropped stitch, the forgotten teaspoon, the out-of-place button, often held the greatest significance. And now she had something new. Someone in the house after the performance, near the fireplace. Someone who knew enough to create a trail and enough to ensure it pointed to someone else. The question was not who had dropped the button. The question was, who had placed it? By midweek, the outward appearance of Charnley St. Mary had returned to normal. The bunting from the fete had been taken down. Fernwood Hall's gates, once flung open to the public, now stood closed, and the parish newsletter, edited with tireless righteousness by Mrs. Bartlett, had managed to make reference to these troubled times no fewer than 7 times in one column. But the calm was only on the surface. Beneath the polished words and polite nods, tension wound tight like a watch spring. Whispers passed more quickly now, as though everyone sensed a storm coming, but none could see where it would break. At the heart of it was Clarissa Arbuthnot. Her reappearance had been calculated, a brief show of charitable service, followed by a luncheon at the vicarage, where she made conspicuous mention of her support for the village flower fund. But for all her graceful poise, there was something brittle in her smile. She was, Miss Marple observed, a woman under siege, and trying very hard to pretend otherwise. It was the vicar, of all people, who accidentally provided the key to her unravelling. They were speaking after evensong, the pews still faintly creaking with recent occupation. "A shame about poor Roper," Reverend Blackwell said, shaking his head. "He wasn't much liked, but still, dreadful business. I did his aunt's funeral 3 years ago. You know, he told me something rather strange back then." "Oh?" Miss Marple inquired, her gloved hands folded neatly around her prayer book. "Yes, he said his solicitor's records would someday put certain people in their place. Sounded like a threat at the time, but I thought nothing of it. Might have been boasting, he was that sort of man." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did he ever mention names?" "Only vaguely. Something about a woman from the theatre. A scandal. That was papered over," he said. Sounded like blackmail, though he never said so directly. Later, over a cup of tea in her own sitting room, Miss Marple reflected on this with a quiet frown. A scandal. Theatre. Clarissa Arbuthnot, and a letter burned in the fireplace. The next day, Miss Marple walked to the edge of the village, to a small, narrow cottage barely clinging to the outskirts. It belonged to Mrs. Mercy Hale, a former actress herself, now retired and regarded with a certain wary distance by the more conservative villagers. "Jane Marple," Mercy said as she opened the door, her voice as gravelly as ever. "Haven't seen you since the Christmas pageant. Come to scold me for missing church?" "Not at all," said Miss Marple, stepping inside. "I've come for tea, and perhaps a memory or two." The cottage smelled of lavender and old costumes. In the corner sat a wooden wardrobe bursting with vintage stage clothes. Mercy herself had been a notable presence on the provincial circuit. Once, tall, sharp-featured, with a voice that could carry over a storm. Now age had softened her, but the dramatic instincts remained. "So," Mercy said, setting down 2 chipped cups. "Is this about Clarissa?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You're perceptive. I know the signs. People only come to me. For two reasons. Scandal or sequins. You're not much for sequins. Did you know her before she came to Charnley? Not personally, Mercy said, but I knew of her. Clarissa Ellington back then. Very pretty, very ambitious. Did a few turns in touring productions. Landed a role in a West End revival briefly. Briefly? Miss Marple prompted. Mercy sipped her tea. She disappeared. Word was she'd been let go rather suddenly. Something about improper conduct. There was talk of an affair with a man in the company, older, connected. She claimed innocence. But someone made sure she didn't get cast again. Blacklisted. Was the man Julian Roper? I couldn't say, but I know he had links to a board of trustees, funding and all that. He could have made her vanish with a few words. If she tried to fight it, maybe there was a paper trail. Letters, accusations. Miss Marple sat back, her mind knitting threads together as deftly as her fingers did yarn. And Leonard Arbuthnot married her afterward. 2 years later. In Monte Carlo, I believe. There were whispers. Always are. When Miss Marple returned to the village, she found Leonard Arbuthnot waiting outside her gate, puffing agitatedly on a cigar. Miss Marple, he began, removing his hat. I'd like to make a few things clear. She raised her brows mildly. Of course, Mr. Arbuthnot, would you like to come in? No. I'll speak here. I know you've been asking questions about Clarissa, about Roper. I've been asking questions about human nature, Mr. Arbuthnot, she corrected gently. Roper's death has prompted many to remember old grievances. Well, leave my wife out of it, he snapped. She's been through enough. I'm sure she has, Miss Marple said calmly, but one must consider motive. Leonard's face darkened. Roper tried to ruin her, years ago. But that's over and done with, is it? She asked quietly. Because I think Roper intended to make it quite current again. I believe he threatened her with exposure, perhaps even with documentation, something she, or you, didn't want public. Leonard looked away. He had a letter from someone. Clarissa never told me the full truth, only that it would destroy her if it got out. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And you wanted to protect her. She's my wife. I love her. And I've done things to shield her that I never imagined I would do for anyone. She said nothing. Leonard dropped the cigar into the gravel. I didn't poison him, if that's what you're thinking. I wouldn't have known how. Miss Marple smiled slightly. No, I don't think you did. But perhaps someone else thought. You might take the fall, or Harwood, or even Clarissa herself. Leonard gave her a sharp look. Are you suggesting someone else in the house did it? I'm not suggesting, she said. I'm observing. And what I've observed is that someone planted a button in the fireplace, ensured Roper drank the brandy, and managed to vanish without drawing attention, all while 3 people in that house had clear motives to want him gone. She paused. I wonder, Mr. Arbuthnot, if perhaps the answer lies not in who was seen, but in who was not. Leonard stiffened. What do you mean? Ruby, Miss Marple said simply. He blinked. The maid. She knew Roper. I've checked. She worked at a guest house in Bournemouth where he often stayed during his legal visits. And I wonder, did she ever mention anything about her brother? Her brother? An aspiring actor. One who was cast aside by the same company that dismissed Clarissa. On Julian Roper's recommendation. Leonard looked thunderstruck. Are you saying she... I'm saying she had reason and opportunity, and she's been overlooked entirely. Miss Marple looked up at him kindly. But we mustn't leap to conclusions. Let us allow the facts and people's behavior to speak for themselves. She turned and walked slowly toward her gate. Behind her, Leonard stood frozen, one hand clenched around his crumpled hat, the other hanging loosely by his side. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple opened her notebook and began a fresh page. 3 motives, 2 obvious suspects. one overlooked servant, and a murderer still at large. It was Thursday morning when the second shock fell upon Charnley St. Mary, quiet, sudden, and yet somehow expected, like the second crack of thunder in a summer storm. Ruby Brewer, the maid, at Fernwood Hall, was missing. Clarissa noticed first. She had rung for tea at 8:30 and received no answer. Assuming Ruby had slept in or slipped out for errands, she had gone to the kitchen herself, still in her silk dressing gown. The sight of the tidy scullery, the untouched boots by the back door and the half-peeled carrots left in a bowl, filled her with a slow, dawning dread. By 10 o'clock, Leonard Arbuthnot had alerted the police. Inspector Craddock arrived in a black mood. "I don't like this," he muttered, running a hand over his thinning hair as he paced Fernwood Hall's servants' quarters. "A murder followed by a disappearance. Either she's on the run, or someone's making sure she—" "Can't talk." Clarissa sat in the morning room, wringing her hands and making no effort to conceal her anxiety. "Ruby wouldn't just vanish. She's been with us for years. She's like family." "Family," Craddock repeated. "Funny how often it's family who keep secrets." Miss Marple, who had been quietly present on the pretext of collecting linens for the church bazaar, said nothing at first. She merely observed. And what she observed was that Clarissa looked genuinely shaken, her lipstick smudged, her gloves mismatched. But Leonard, by contrast, appeared grim, not startled. He'd expected this, Miss Marple thought, or feared it. The constables searched the grounds. There was no sign of struggle, no note left behind. Ruby's small suitcase was gone, as were some pair of modest shoes and her overcoat. Her room was meticulously tidy, too tidy perhaps. On her dressing table sat a hairbrush, a china figurine of a ballerina, and a half-written letter. Craddock picked it up carefully with gloved fingers. "To her brother," he said aloud. "It reads like a farewell, but it stops mid-sentence." Miss Marple peered at the paper. "She was interrupted," she said softly, "and rather suddenly." Craddock frowned. "You really think she had something to do with Roper's death?" Miss Marple didn't answer at first. She studied the writing, the neatness of the loops, the way the ink had started to pool just before the nib trailed off. "I think she knew more than she let on, and I think she was frightened." Clarissa stood suddenly. "Frightened of what?" Miss Marple turned her head. "Or whom, my dear?" By the afternoon the village was buzzing again, this time with theories more wild than ever. "Kidnapped," Mrs. Bartlett insisted. "She saw something and was silenced." "Nonsense," countered Mr. Blake, the retired schoolmaster. "She ran. Guilty conscience." "Perhaps she and Roper were lovers," Daisy Entwistle added in a whisper at the greengrocer's. "And she just couldn't take it." Miss Marple, overhearing all of this as she selected apples, reflected that gossip, while rarely accurate, often revealed more than the gossips intended. For beneath the outrage, the shock, the speculation, there was a growing sense of fear. No one quite believed this was over anymore. That evening, Miss Marple invited Inspector Craddock to tea again. The mood was heavier than before, the conversation more clipped. "She left on foot," Craddock said. "One of the local boys saw her walking across the fields toward the old railway path just after sunrise. No sign of her since. And no one saw where she went from there." "She was not one to run away lightly," Miss Marple said. "She took care of her duties, folded her laundry with corners precise enough to shame a military quartermaster. No, Inspector, Ruby left either in desperation or under duress." Craddock sighed. "What do you make of the letter?" "She was trying to warn someone, or confess something. But the key, I think, lies in what she did not say. Her words trail off after the line, 'I thought I could live with it, but—'" "But what? Exactly. That's the question. What changed between the day of the murder and her disappearance?" Craddock tapped his fingers against the teacup. "Maybe someone told her the police suspected her." Miss Marple shook her head. No, Ruby wasn't the sort to flee the law, but she might flee someone else. They sat in silence for a moment. She was loyal to Clarissa, Miss Marple said at last. Protective, even. I wonder, was that loyalty mutual? Craddock raised his brows. You think Clarissa might know more about Ruby's past? I think Clarissa knows more than she's told anyone. The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the edge of the old railway path where Ruby had last been seen. The fields were high with summer grass, the wildflowers bright with bees. She walked slowly, eyes scanning the gravel, the brambles, the split fence rails, and then, caught in a tangle of hawthorn, she saw it. A torn scrap of fabric, blue-grey tweed, no more than 3 inches wide, with a brass thread running through it. Miss Marple turned it over. It looked like the inside lining of a coat cuff, not Ruby's coat. Ruby's was plain and woolen, dark brown. No brass thread, but someone else in the household wore a blue-grey tweed coat. Leonard Arbuthnot. She returned to the village by the long, away stopping at the vicarage, where Clarissa was once again holding court in the garden. She was surrounded by 3 ladies from the choir and a tray of orange sponge. Her laughter was just a touch too loud. Miss Marple waited until the others had dispersed, then joined her. A dreadful business about Ruby, she said with gentle gravity. Clarissa nodded, then leaned in, lowering her voice. Do you think she's dead? I think she's in danger, Miss Marple said evenly, and I think someone wanted her gone, perhaps even tried to make her disappear in more ways than one. Clarissa blinked. But why? She knew about Julian Roper, about the letter, and she may have seen who went into the study that afternoon. Clarissa's face went pale. Leonard said she didn't. Leonard says many things, Miss Marple said softly, but he's under strain, and when men are under strain, they often make decisions that look like logic but are really desperation. Clarissa swallowed hard. You think Leonard? I think Leonard's past may not be as spotless as he claims. He was in business with Roper once, briefly but significantly, enough for there to be secrets, misconduct, or worse. Clarissa was silent. Did you love him? Miss Marple asked suddenly. Clarissa stared. What a question. Love is the most dangerous motive of all, Miss Marple said gently. More than money, more than revenge, it drives people to silence. To protect, to lie. Clarissa said nothing. Then, I did once, but after the letters came, after Roper, things changed. Leonard tried to help, but he was never helping me. Only protecting what people would say. I understand, Miss Marple said, rising. But if you want to truly protect someone now, Ruby, for instance, you must tell the truth. Clarissa looked away, her shoulders drawn tight. Miss Marple left without another word. That evening, as Miss Marple sat quietly knitting, there was a knock at the door. It was Dominic Harwood. I received this in my coat pocket, he said, holding out a crumpled slip of paper. No envelope, just this. Miss Marple took it and read, Don't trust them. I saw who did it. I'm going to the place he used to meet her, the one with the piano. R. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. The place he used to meet her, Harwood nodded. He used to meet Clarissa here in the village before she married Leonard. That's what the gossip said anyway. Do you know where? Harwood hesitated. The music room, in the old summer house behind the rectory. It's been locked. For years. Miss Marple stood at once. Then we must go. Now. The summer house behind the rectory was a forgotten place. Years ago it had hosted garden teas, amateur recitals, and secret assignations among the villagers more romantically inclined. Now it stood disused, the ivy creeping thick over its stone threshold. The key to its warped wooden door kept quietly in the vicarage since the last church fair 3 summers prior. By the time Miss Marple and Dominic Harwood arrived, the sky was beginning to shift, late afternoon light falling through the trees in long gold-laced shadows. Harwood hesitated. "Are you certain she meant this place?" "Certain enough to follow a hunch," Miss Marple replied, removing a spare key from her handbag. "There's very little in life that surprises me anymore, Mr. Harwood, but this has the feel of something orchestrated." The door creaked as it opened, moaning softly on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was cool and faintly musty. Dust motes danced in the fading light. A few old chairs were stacked against the walls, and in the center, covered by a frayed muslin sheet, stood a weathered upright piano. Miss Marple crossed to it at once. She ran her fingers along the cloth, then carefully peeled it away. The piano was scuffed and chipped, but intact. On its lid, faint but visible, lay a single sheet of notepaper. She read it aloud. "I know what I saw. You were wrong to think I wouldn't speak. Meet me here before sunset. R." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's in the..." Same hand as the note slipped into Mr. Harwood's pocket. But it wasn't meant for him. Someone else was meant to find this. Harwood took a step back. "She came here, Ruby, but whoever she was meeting..." "Never arrived," Miss Marple finished. "Or did and saw she wasn't alone. We must assume she was here earlier today. Whether she left again, well, that remains to be seen." She turned suddenly, her eyes bright. "Would you do something for me, Mr. Harwood? Anything. Send a message to Leonard Arbuthnot. Say you've had second thoughts. Say you've remembered something. Something that could clear your name, but implicates him. Ask him to meet you here, alone, at 7. Harwood hesitated. "That's dangerous." "It's the only way," she said quietly. "We must find out what he's hiding." Harwood left at once, and Miss Marple remained alone in the summer house. She dusted off one of the chairs and sat beside the piano, knitting quietly as the light dimmed and the shadows grew long and sharp around her. At 6:45, she heard footsteps, not Dominic's. He would not be returning, she had made that very clear. He was to leave the village at once and wait for a telegram. She'd seen the fear in his eyes, and had no intention of letting him risk his life any further. The steps came closer, crunching on gravel. A hand appeared on the doorframe. It was Leonard Arbuthnot. His expression was tightly composed, but Miss Marple, expert in the unspoken language of tension, saw the tautness of his jaw, the way his fingers twitched as he stepped inside. "Miss Marple," he said. "I was expecting Harwood." She smiled mildly. "Yes, I rather thought you might be." He looked around. "Is this a trap?" "No, Mr. Arbuthnot. A test. You see, people say all kinds of things under pressure. They lie to protect others, to protect themselves. But when they're alone or think they are, the truth has a way of surfacing." He stiffened. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," she said gently. "I'm inviting you to explain something, if you can." He glanced again at the piano. "What's this place to you?" "To me, nothing. To you, I should think, a memory of Clarissa, of meetings kept in secret." His eyes narrowed. "You're meddling." "It's what I do best," she agreed cheerfully. He took a deep breath. "Why did you ask me here?" "I didn't. Ruby did." He froze. "She left you a note," Miss Marple continued, "though not precisely addressed. She was desperate. She'd discovered something, or perhaps she'd simply had enough of keeping other people's secrets." Leonard's voice was low. "She shouldn't have been involved. She was involved from the moment Clarissa brought her into this house and made her a silent witness to her pain. She tried to protect your wife, Mr. Arbuthnot, even when it meant placing herself at risk." His mouth twitched. Miss Marple rose. "Ruby saw who went into the study that day. She knew the brandy had been tampered with, and she knew that the discarded button in the fireplace didn't belong to Harwood at all, but came from your own coat." His eyes snapped to hers. She continued, her tone cool and precise. "You tore it off yourself, didn't you, or cut it rather? Sewed it into the lining of Harwood's waistcoat while it was unattended. planted a thread to mislead, a calculated effort to frame him. No need to deny it, she said kindly. I've already sent Inspector Craddock to examine the coat. He'll find the sleeve cuff inside out and missing one button, the mate to the one I found in the hearth. Leonard exhaled. Slowly. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Murders rarely are. He crossed to the piano and sat heavily on the bench. Roper was going to destroy her, Clarissa. He had letters. He said he'd show them to the press. She begged me not to do anything, said it was her battle, but I couldn't. Just sit back. So you poisoned him? Leonard shook his head. No, I wanted to. But I didn't. I bought the poison. I was going to put it in his drink, but I lost my nerve. I couldn't follow through. He turned to her, eyes desperate. I swear to you, Miss Marple, I was prepared to do it, but when I saw him there, I just walked away. It wasn't me. Then who? I don't know, he said miserably, but someone beat me to it. They sat in silence, the old piano looming between them like a gravestone. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was very soft. Tell me, Leonard, where were you between 6 and 7 this morning? He blinked. At home. With Clarissa? No, she said. You weren't. She stepped forward and placed a folded scrap of fabric on the piano lid. The tweed cuff fragment. Found it near the railway path. Caught in hawthorn. Right where Ruby was last seen. That's your coat, is it not? Leonard stared at it. His mouth opened, then closed, and Miss Marple saw it, the reaction she'd been waiting for. Not confusion, not denial. Guilt. You went after her, she said. She fled after the note. You followed, perhaps to silence her, perhaps to beg. Her not to go to the police, but something happened. Leonard stood suddenly towering over her. You have no proof. I don't need proof, she said gently. I have human nature, and yours is cracking under the weight of what you've done. He wavered, then sat again, covering his face with his hands. I didn't mean to hurt her, he murmured. I couldn't let her ruin Clarissa. Miss Marple stood very still, and now 2 people are dead because of secrets buried in music and pride. From outside came the sound of gravel shifting under boots. Inspector Craddock stepped. Into the doorway, a shadow at the threshold. Leonard looked up. So this was a trap. Miss Marple turned, her expression as serene as ever. No, Mr. Arbuthnot, she said. It was a test. Fernwood Hall was quiet that evening, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the faint rustle of wind in the ivy. Clarissa Arbuthnot sat alone in the drawing-room, her features paler than usual, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief as though trying to untie some invisible knot. She had been waiting for news. Miss Marple arrived just past 8, ushered, in not by a maid. There was none now, but by Leonard himself. His face was pale, waxy, his eyes red-rimmed. Clarissa stood as he entered, but he gave a small shake of his head and turned away without a word. Inspector Craddock followed behind, his step heavy, his gaze cool and watchful. Miss Marple took the seat nearest the hearth. The armchair was the same one she had occupied at the fete, just before the music began and death followed. She rested her handbag on her lap and folded her hands over it. I think, she said gently, it is time we spoke plainly. Clarissa glanced at her husband. Leonard? He said nothing. Miss Marple began. Julian Roper was a manipulative man. He thrived on secrets, particularly those that could be used against others. Years ago he ruined your career, Clarissa. Not by accident, by design. You were a rising star with promise and attention. He saw in you something he could not control, and so he destroyed it. Clarissa's voice was barely above a whisper. He sent letters to my director, accused me of improprieties, false things. "He framed you," Miss Marple confirmed. "Then he held that past over you for years, including a letter, proof of a personal scandal you'd never made public. He came to Fernwood Hall intending to blackmail you with it. Isn't that so?" Clarissa nodded, her eyes glistening. "He said if I didn't pay or persuade Leonard to help him settle a matter involving land and a lost inheritance, he'd go public." Miss Marple turned to Leonard. "And you were ready to kill him for it." Leonard's hands clenched. "I couldn't let him do it again, not to her, not to us." "You obtained cyanide," Miss Marple said. "You poured it into a small vial. You meant to dose the brandy." "I carried it in my pocket," Leonard admitted. "I went into the study. I even uncorked the bottle, but I couldn't do it. I didn't pour it in." Miss Marple nodded. "No, you didn't." Clarissa looked up sharply. "Then someone else?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone else." She reached into her bag and removed the black button, the one she'd found in the fireplace. She placed it gently on the tea tray beside her. This was planted, a trap intended to incriminate Dominic Harwood, clever in its way, but too deliberate. Mr. Harwood's waistcoat never had buttons of this kind. That alone told me someone meant to direct attention. She looked toward Clarissa. "It wasn't you, was it?" Clarissa shook her head slowly. "I was terrified. But I didn't touch the brandy. I wanted Julian gone, yes, but not like that." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "No, you weren't the killer. Nor was your husband, though his hands are not clean. But there was someone else in this house that day. Someone who knew all the players, who had seen the letters. Someone no one suspected because she was always there, blending into the background." Clarissa gasped. "Ruby?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "She overheard Roper threaten you. She'd seen you suffer, watched Leonard's descent into rage and desperation. And Ruby had her own reason to hate Roper. He had tormented her brother years ago, destroyed his chances on the stage. A young man with promise and no connections." Craddock interjected, his voice grave. "We've confirmed the link. Ruby's brother, Thomas Brewer, applied to the same theatre company where Roper served as a patron. Rejected with a personal letter from Roper citing moral unsuitability. The boy later took his own life." Miss Marple continued. "Ruby didn't act impulsively. She waited. She followed Roper into the study during the interval. She poured the cyanide into the decanter after Leonard had left, knowing he would still be the one suspected. And then she returned to her duties, calm, unnoticed, just another servant doing her job." Clarissa trembled. "But then why would she run?" "Because she saw what was coming," Miss Marple said. "She thought she could live with it, believing she'd done justice, protected her mistress. But then Harwood was named a suspect, and she realized the wrong man might pay for her crime. She wrote a letter. She meant to confess or perhaps reveal what she'd seen. But someone found out." She turned back to Leonard. "You followed her." He said nothing. "I found a piece of your coat torn on the path," Miss Marple said gently. "You went after her at dawn. Not to kill her, at least not at first. Perhaps to beg her to keep quiet, or perhaps to silence her if she refused." Leonard's voice cracked. "She fell. We were arguing. I tried to stop her from leaving. She slipped down the embankment. Hit her head. It was an accident." Clarissa gasped. "She died instantly," Leonard whispered. "I panicked. I carried her, hid the body behind the summer house. I didn't know what else to do." Craddock stepped forward. "We'll recover her, Mr. Arbuthnot, and you'll make a statement." Leonard gave a weary nod. "I suppose that's the end of it." But Miss Marple wasn't finished. "There is still one more deception," she said quietly. "The button was not planted by Ruby. She acted out of grief. She left no trace. The button, Leonard, was your addition, afterward. A desperate attempt to shift suspicion once more. Not from guilt over murder, but over what you hadn't done. You saw your chance to turn the entire affair toward Harwood, and you took it." He bowed his head. "Yes." Clarissa wept silently. Miss Marple turned to her and said gently, "He did it all for you, but it was never yours to bear." Silence held them for a long moment. Then Craddock said, "We'll take him now." Quietly. He helped Leonard to his feet and led him from the room. Clarissa looked across the drawing-room, her eyes drifting to the now-closed piano. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she asked Miss Marple. "Not all along," she replied. "But the music told me much. There is a kind of tension in silence, when a note should resolve and does not. I've spent a lifetime listening for those unresolved notes, in people as well as music." Clarissa gave a sad smile. "And now? Now the village will grieve again. Then it will forget, as it always does. But I shan't forget Ruby. Or the way a woman's loyalty can echo longer than applause." Clarissa remained seated long after the door closed behind Inspector Craddock and Leonard. The silence that followed was not the strained hush of concealment or dread, but the leaden quiet of aftermath. It lay heavy in the corners of the drawing-room, where music had once filled the air, and secrets had whispered behind every polite smile. Miss Marple did not move at first. She allowed the moment to settle, knowing that clarity often came in stillness. Clarissa's eyes were fixed on the hearth, the ashes long cooled. At length Miss Marple rose and crossed to the sideboard, where the decanter still sat, refilled now as though the murder might be undone by ritual. "Will they hang him?" Clarissa asked without looking up. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "No, that is no longer our way, but he will answer for what he has done, not only in court, in his conscience too." Clarissa gave a dry, hollow laugh. "If he has one left." Miss Marple returned to her chair. "He loved you, my dear. And love, especially the kind that believes itself righteous, is capable of the most terrible distortions. Leonard convinced himself he was shielding you from ruin. In truth, he was shielding himself from shame. His pride became his morality." Clarissa clutched the handkerchief tighter. "I told him I didn't want his help. I begged him to let it go. But he wouldn't believe I could live with disgrace." "Perhaps he could not imagine a world in which you could survive without him," Miss Marple said. "Some men confuse love with control, others with protection. Either way, the result is the same." The grandfather clock chimed 9. Clarissa flinched. Outside, the village settled into the hush of late evening. Lamps flickered behind curtains, and the winding lanes grew still, save for the rustle of hedgerows and the occasional bark of a distant dog. The scandal would not be fully known until the morning, but the undercurrent had already begun its work. Mrs. Bartlett had seen Craddock leave the hall with Leonard, and speculation would blossom by breakfast like frost on glass. Miss Marple stood, her knees stiff from sitting. "You'll be well looked after. The vicar's wife is already organizing meals, and you'll find that sympathy in a village, though rarely expressed directly, is never in short supply." Clarissa looked up, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief on her face. "After everything, human beings are curious creatures," Miss Marple said, retrieving her handbag. "They gossip terribly, judge hastily, and forget most things given enough time. But when someone is truly broken, they know it, and they respond in kind." At the door, she paused. "You should tell them the truth, Clarissa. Not the whole village, but those who matter, the vicar, the police. Your story deserves its own voice, not merely Leonard's shadow of it." Clarissa nodded slowly. "And Ruby?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "Ruby deserves more than she will ever receive, but she will not be forgotten. I'll see to that." She stepped out into the night. The path to her cottage glowed with the faint silver of moonlight. Each step felt weighted with reflection, as if the village itself were exhaling the breath it had held since the fete. The scent of summer, grass, rose and faint wood smoke lingered in the air. As she passed the green, she paused at the church gates. The bell tower loomed against the sky, solemn and familiar. In the churchyard, the yew trees stood still as sentries. Somewhere beneath their branches, Julian Roper awaited burial. In time, Ruby Brewer would lie not far from him. Their lives, so different, would share the same soil, ironic perhaps, but inevitable. The next morning dawned clear and quiet. Miss Marple, seated at her small kitchen table, sipped tea while the wireless murmured faintly in the background. The news had not yet reached the national headlines, but the village was alive with it. By 9, the baker knew. By 10, so did the postmaster. Craddock called just before 11. His tone was gruff, but respectful. "You were right. We found Ruby's body behind the summer house, just as you said. No signs of struggle beyond the injury to her head. Looked like a fall. We recovered the remains of the vial, too, hidden behind the garden wall, traced to Leonard's study drawer." Miss Marple nodded to herself. "And the letter?" "Burned, beyond recognition. But handwriting fragments match one of Roper's previous legal correspondences. Our forensics man confirmed it. And the theatre company corroborated his relationship with Clarissa, though unofficially, of course." "Of course," Craddock paused. "You've done it again, Miss Marple, though I can't say I enjoy watching you maneuver suspects like chess pieces." "Neither do I," she said softly. "But sometimes the only way to reveal truth is to gently corner it. Do you ever rest?" "Only after a pot of tea and a proper piece of seed cake." He chuckled. "I'll make sure you get one." She hung up and returned to her garden, where the bees moved lazily among the lavender. The hydrangeas needed trimming, and her delphiniums were beginning to tilt under their own weight. Normality, like ivy, always found a way to grow back over ruin. The villagers, too, found their rhythm again. Dominic Harwood left the following day, carrying nothing but a suitcase and the faint hope of a fresh beginning. He stopped briefly by Miss Marple's gate, removed his hat and said only, "Thank you." She offered him a tin of ginger biscuits and a kind smile. "Keep playing," she said. "There's more truth in music than in most confessions." Clarissa remained at Fernwood Hall, at least for the time being. Rumour had it she'd taken to tending the rose garden herself and had donated a sum to fund a small scholarship for local music students in Ruby's name. No one spoke ill of her, at least not aloud. As for Miss Marple, she resumed her routines. She attended tea at the vicarage, debated marigolds versus snapdragons at the garden club, and won second place in the annual preserves competition, losing narrowly to Mrs. Weatherby's damson jam. But if she seemed quieter than usual, more reflective, it was only natural. She had seen once again the sharp edge beneath the surface of gentility, the way love, pride, and pain could twist lives into knots too tangled to unpick, until tragedy forced them open. One evening, weeks later, she sat beneath her rose trellis and took out her knitting. The pattern was simple, the motion soothing. A robin chirped from the hedge, and the breeze carried the scent of sun-warmed thyme. She paused a moment and looked toward the village. "People think evil comes loudly," she said to no one in particular, "but more often it arrives with a polite smile, a delicate step, and a perfectly respectable reason." And then, as always, she returned to her stitching. Because life, like a mystery, must go on, stitch by stitch, clue by clue, until all the threads are tied. The church bell tolled softly in the distance once, twice, echoing through the calm evening air of Charnley St. Mary. The scandal of Fernwood Hall had, in its way, settled like mist over the village. Not forgotten, never that, but absorbed as all things were in time. Leonard Arbuthnot had been remanded to await trial in London. His confession, full of anguish and contradiction, had shaken the local court and sparked interest from national papers. Yet no headline could quite capture the strange mix of grief, guilt, and desperate loyalty that had motivated his crimes. He had not killed Julian Roper, but he had tried to, and he had allowed the real killer's actions to go unpunished until fear made him act again. Ruby Brewer's tragic end had ensured that he would answer not just to the law, but to his own conscience. Clarissa, quiet and resolute, had not left the village. That fact alone surprised many. She had taken up residence in the cottage once owned by the retired seamstress Miss Pollard, now vacant near the green. Fernwood Hall had been shuttered temporarily, its grandeur dimmed. Clarissa no longer performed charity in the public eye. She tended her garden, she volunteered in the church flower rota, and she wrote, privately, at a desk by the window. Some said it was a memoir, others claimed it was a letter she never intended to send. Miss Marple did not pry. She never asked for more than a person willingly gave. That perhaps was her greatest strength, not merely in solving mysteries, but in understanding people. One crisp autumn afternoon, the vicar himself came to tea. He brought with him a small bundle of correspondence and an expression of cautious curiosity. "I thought you might want to see this," he said, handing her a letter wrapped in brown paper. It was found among Ruby's belongings, after her. Brother's things were examined, locked in a small case she kept hidden. Miss Marple unfolded the note, yellowed with age, and folded twice. The handwriting was elegant, if faintly hurried. "To Miss C. Ellington, I have reviewed your contract and found it lacking in discretion and gratitude. I cannot, in good conscience, recommend your continuation with the company. There are concerns. If you wish to discuss them, I suggest silence and distance." J.R. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it gently aside. "There it is," she murmured. "The ruin of a reputation in 50 words. The vicar looked troubled. "Why keep—" "It had to remind herself, I expect," Miss Marple said, "of why she acted, of what injustice looked like in ink." They sat in silence for a moment. Then the vicar asked, "Do you believe in justice, Miss Marple? In the end?" She smiled faintly. "I believe in balance, Reverend. Justice is rarely tidy, but the truth has a way of settling into place like a teacup finding its saucer, eventually." That night, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple lit a small lamp by the window and opened her diary. She wrote briefly, as she always did after a case, in careful, modest script. Julian Roper, poisoned by justice disguised as loyalty. Ruby Brewer, a heart broken long before her body ever fell. Leonard Arbuthnot, undone not by crime but by fear. Clarissa, the survivor, as women so often are. She paused, then added, "Truth revealed not by force nor by brilliance, but by watching, listening, and knowing what people do when no one believes they're being watched." Miss Marple closed the book and returned it to its shelf beside the fireplace. The flames flickered gently, casting warm, dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind stirred the trees and the village held its breath in sleep. She reached for her knitting, pale wool this time, meant for a new baby in the parish. She began again quietly as always, her fingers nimble and sure, because there would be another crime someday, another tangle of love and pride and pain, and she would be ready. After all, evil never announces itself. It arrives quietly, often just before tea.